We've long abandoned the practice of asking where the bottom is for Donald Trump and his supporters in Congress, but we may finally have an answer. Today, as decorated combat veteran Alexander Vindman, who works as the top Ukraine expert at the White House, headed to Capitol Hill to testify in the impeachment investigation into Donald Trump. He did so after being accused of being a spy by right-wing defenders of the president. It's a despicable smear on a man who says he voiced his concerns about Donald Trump's demand for dirt on political rivals from the Ukrainians out of a sense of duty. We'll get to the GOP attempts at character assassination that will define the president and his party long after today's hearing. But we start with the facts that are sending the president into a tailspin today, as one more witness, and this time one who listened in on the fateful call between Donald Trump and President Zelensky, offers devastating testimony confirming the pressure campaign against the Ukrainians. The case against the president gains an unimpeachable witness, and one with firsthand knowledge of the phone call that put the president's impeachment in motion. Vindman, who served multiple overseas tours and was awarded a Purple Heart for his service in Iraq, testified that he reported to his superiors on 2 occasions his concerns about the pressure campaign against the Ukrainians who were being asked to deliver political favors to the president. In his opening statement, Vindman describes his alarm over what he heard on the president's call, saying this, quote, "I was concerned by the call. I did not think it was proper to demand that a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen, and I was worried about the implications for the U.S. government's support of Ukraine. I realized that if Ukraine pursued an investigation into the Bidens and Burisma, it would likely be interpreted as a partisan play, which would undoubtedly result in Ukraine losing the bipartisan support it has thus far maintained. This would all undermine U.S. national security. Following the call, I again reported my concerns to NSC's lead counsel." Vindman also delivering an implicit rebuke of the misconduct he witnessed, saying this, quote, "I am a patriot, and it is my sacred duty and honor to advance and defend our country, irrespective of party or politics. For over 20 years as an active duty United States military officer and diplomat, I have served this country in a nonpartisan manner and have done so with the utmost respect and professionalism for both Republicans and Democrats." Reports from Capitol Hill today also strongly suggest that Republicans were determined to learn more about the whistleblower's identity from Vindman. Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz telling NBC News what she saw behind closed doors, saying this, quote, "What the Republicans are trying to do very clearly in their questioning is try to front door, backdoor Vindman into revealing who the whistleblower is." And that is where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. With us on Capitol Hill, MSNBC's Garrett Haake. At the New York Times, White House correspondent Annie Carney. Former Republican congressman, now an independent, David Jolly's back. And with us at the table, former federal prosecutor for the Southern and Eastern Districts of New York, Barrett Berger. Plus, our friend Donny Deutsch is back. Garrett, let me start with you. Take me inside the room with Alexander Vindman.
Well, Vindman's testimony this morning, or all day today, really has been very credible. Every Republican and Democratic lawmaker who came out talked about someone who is a very serious professional, dedicated his life to this country, came once again with notes and specific details about his concerns about the president's behavior, and not just on that phone call. Remember, Vindman is important in part because he is the first witness who was actually listening to that phone call to come testify. And while he raised concerns about what he heard on that phone call, he also raised concerns weeks earlier in another meeting in which he heard the same language being used by Gordon Sondland, the president's ambassador to the EU, about linking investigations of the Bidens to military aid. So Vindman was on the record not once, but twice with his concerns. And he goes a little bit further. He's very important to Democrats in particular because he makes an explicit argument that what the president did weakens America's national security. Democrats have hung their entire impeachment strategy on making this about something bigger than another presidential no-no. They have said that the president's actions hurt national security. Vindman says the same thing, that by connecting our defense of Ukraine on the front line against Russia to political prerogatives of the president of the United States, the president put national security at risk. And that is what makes him important, and that is part of what has made him something of a contentious witness for both parties today.
Garrett, I'm struck by the images. And when you look at how quickly and how dramatically public opinion has swung, 55% of Americans in the latest Quinnipiac poll now support Donald Trump's impeachment and removal from office, numbers that never appeared nearly that high after the Mueller report. And you look at this witness, and if you just slow down and just take me through the drama of seeing Alexander Vindman in full uniform appear on Capitol Hill as the first witness in the impeachment investigation who was on the line listening to the call that Donald Trump still describes as perfect, but that put the entire impeachment process in motion.
Well, you can take it back further than that. Take it back to last night when his opening statement started to leak out. You had some right-wing defenders of the president attacking his credibility before he even shows up. Then in walks Vindman in his full dress uniform as a lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army, somebody who had been wounded in Iraq, a Purple Heart recipient, who is also the first sitting White House staffer, someone who could go back to his desk tonight and find a box sitting on it if the president wants to go that far. I mean, could be fired for showing up here, but instead puts, the bird on his shoulder, gets in his full dress uniform and comes down here and testifies for, a session that is still ongoing right now. That's the framing that Democrats have always wanted for this impeachment inquiry, that this is about country, not party. It's about sacred duty. And you heard some of that same language in Vindman's opening statement, that he's a patriot, he's an immigrant to this country, and he does see all of this as his duty to defend the nation. He sees that as what he's doing in that room today.
Annie Carney, if the White House had a nightmare scenario for the president's impeachment investigation, this had to be it. A witness who's an Iraqi war veteran, who's not a partisan, who could never under any scenario be described as part of a deep state, heading to Capitol Hill and describing picking up the phone or walking upstairs to the White House counsel's office, and not once, but twice, voicing his concerns internally, trying to raise the alarms about what he saw as a rogue foreign policy. What's the White House have to say for itself today, other than smearing this man?
I mean, not much. It's quiet. Like, a lot of people have been very low key. The people, Jared Kushner, who has taken a lead role in impeachment, is in Riyadh at a conference. Mick Mulvaney has been keeping a low profile since his press briefing. Rudy Giuliani has been MIA. So the people we usually hear from or are driving a message are keeping a low profile right now. But this is exactly the profile of a man who is hard to argue with. And the smear campaigns, to me, seemed like they didn't stick. You see this guy walking in his uniform. He's an immigrant who came to this country and believes in this country and served for this country, who feels that it's his civic duty to his adopted homeland to go and testify against the president of the United States. This is probably not where he saw his career leading him to this moment. Also, another thing that came out here, at least in the opening statement, is that his testimony now really brings into question the testimony of Sondland, who is a Trump appointee, a former campaign donor, who this is the third witness to come forward and sort of contradict what Sondland, in his testimony, told Congress. So it's opened up not just questions about Donald Trump's conduct, but questions about whether other people involved in this investigation have possibly perjured themselves in the process.
Andy, that's exactly where I wanted to go with you. Thank you for leading me there. I think I have that. I think I can put that up. So here's what Vindman testified to, and here's where there's daylight, I think is putting it generously at this point. It's a flat-out contradiction in the view of some Democrats that have heard both of these testimonies. So here's what Vindman testified to. I stated to Ambassador Sondland that his statements were inappropriate, that the request to investigate Biden and his son had nothing to do with national security, and that such investigations were not something the NSC was going to get involved in or push. Now, that account from Vindman has been corroborated by Fiona Hill and Bill Taylor's testimony. Here's the part of the Sondland testimony that's being scrutinized under the Klieg lights today. Sondland testified to this, quote, I recall no discussions with any State Department or White House official about former Vice President Biden or his son. nor do I recall taking part in any effort to encourage an investigation into the Bidens. So there have been sort of rumblings about Sondland having some exposure on perjury since last week. But I think this week it comes into focus as you see those two. One of those statements must not be true.
One of those statements must be true, and it's 3 against 1 now. And again, it's like you look at the backgrounds of the people and the characters here, and Vindman is a very person who's not political, who's a military background, who seems to be doing this out of a sense of duty, not out of a sense of protecting anyone involved. Sondland comes at this story as a Trump appointee, as a political appointee, as someone who has supported the president's campaign. So we see different motivations here at play, potentially.
Annie, I want to get you on the record about another sort of character in the impeachment drama that we haven't talked about much, but you and your colleagues have reported on him a good deal. He's the person in the White House counsel's office sort of detailed or assigned to dealing with matters of national security. This is from some reporting from sort of the beginning of this scandal about the CIA also reaching out to this lawyer who had the 2 alarms raised from Alexander Vindman. You guys reported this. The CIA's general counsel, Courtney Simmons Elwood, called John A. Eisenberg, a deputy White House counsel and her counterpart at the National Security Council, according to 3 people familiar with the matter. He was already aware of vague concerns about the call. Ms. Elwood, Mr. Eisenberg, and their deputies spoke multiple times the following week. They decided that the accusations had a reasonable basis. So Mr. Eisenberg now is in receipt of a fire alarm pulled at the CIA by the CIA General Counsel when she first became aware of this whistleblower's consternation. It's my understanding that he wasn't able to file his complaint at the CIA, had to go to the DNI. He also was aware of at least 1 call, maybe 2, from Alexander Vindman. What are folks close to Mr. Eisenberg saying about his knowledge, and what did he do with all these red flags?
Well, part of what he did was put this transcript someplace different from where it was supposed to be, where it wasn't as accessible as it should have been, knowing that this transcript was a problematic document for the president. This, again, is sort of like a test, another example of how Donald Trump has been an amazing civics lesson for learning where do you do when you have a complaint and you need to report it to your superior? How far does it go? This is another reason why what are the different options for someone who is struck internally by behavior that they believe is wrong? The whistleblower took one approach, reporting it to the White House counsel's office is another approach. Talking to journalists or writing anonymous op-eds is another approach. Yeah. People have taken different approaches when they are concerned with behavior that they witness inside of this administration. This is also a question of more and more pressure of, we need to hear from John Bolton, who was kind of where the buck stops and was privy to a lot of these conversations, direct contact with the president on these matters, and that's still a big question. Will John Bolton testify or not?
David Jolly, there are these 2 hot spinning plates today that seem to be a devastating witness for the president and someone with, as Annie Carney's alluding to, no motive, nothing in his DNA that would incentivize telling a lie. Also, nothing in his DNA that would motivate or inspire him to make waves. I mean, military officials have reverence for the chain of command, so that he raised concerns at all is different from a civilian raising concerns and simply complaining to a chief of staff. Can you just expand on some of the substantive testimony that he gave today, as well as the symbolic impact of his presence up on Capitol Hill as an impeachment witness?
The symbolic impact is you have somebody who is honoring his duty to the country ahead of any political duty, which is different than most of the characters we have seen thus far. Sondland, even Bill Taylor and others, those who may be career, but they are not active duty service members. Taylor, formerly a West Point person who did serve. what you had today in Lieutenant Colonel Vindman was somebody essentially going around the chain of command. He ultimately reports to the commander-in-chief, but today he decided that he was willing to speak to the United States Congress, even if it would shine a dark light on the commander-in-chief. His role in the sequence of the impeachment process and making the case analytically to the Congress and the American people is this. It's elemental. Donald Trump confessed to essentially an impeachable act. Donald Trump confessed to asking Ukraine to investigate Biden. Mick Mulvaney corroborated it when he said, we do it all the time, get over it. Bill Taylor last week confirmed it in his testimony, and Colonel Vindman explained it today. And the dispositive statement that Vindman left, and Garrett referred to this earlier, is he said, my concern is that it would undermine the national security of the United States. That is the frame that the colonel has provided around all of the confessions and corroborations and confirmation. And it is why I have said this before, I believe it with certainty, Donald Trump will become the third president impeached by the House of Representatives, the fourth if you include Nixon. And the longer this goes on, though the likelihood is still small, I think the likelihood grows that he could be facing expulsion through a conviction in the United States Senate.
You agree about the strength of the case?
I do. It seems like the Democrats are really building their case slowly, but witness by witness. I mean, one of the things you said in the lead was here they have this unassailable witness. Coming from my perspective as a former prosecutor, we didn't get witnesses like this. You had to build your case with people that oftentimes had really checkered criminal pasts. To see somebody like this come in with their, uniform on, reciting their history of service to this country, it is a strong basis to build a case.
And what do you think about, we have a list of all the witnesses so far: Kurt Volker, Marie Yovanovitch, Fiona Hill, George Kent, Michael McKinley, Gordon Sondland, Bill Taylor, Laura Cooper, Colonel Alexander Vindman. None of these people household names, all of these people with so much more to lose than gain. And it would appear that these, before this week, largely anonymous diplomats and career public servants, if you look at how public opinion has swung in a way that it never swung during the Mueller probe, it has to do with the fact that none of these people are political figures. They are all people who spent their lives and their careers serving the country, Democrats and Republicans.
Absolutely. And from my perspective, that's why it is just so frustrating to see the vitriol that comes out before we've even seen these people's testimony, before it's actually been made completely public, but really trying to undercut them, saying, this is a never Trumper making these statements.
Is that witness tampering?
Well, exactly. I mean, it really, to me, strikes me as sort of a pattern of witness tampering here. Yeah. I mean, not only do these people have to overcome the incredible administrative hurdles just to get their story out there, just to be heard, but then they have to do this all in the face of knowing they're going to be personally attacked by the President of the United States. I mean, if this isn't witness tampering or a way of discouraging other people to come forward, I don't know what is.
So, Donnie, tie this all together, because I feel like you're always the voice of caution. When it seems this clear, your feeling is it never is, that there's a big swath of the country that accepts the lunacy they hear from the right.
Well, it's interesting. That's exactly where I was going to go. I want to talk about a story, because today the story got very clear. If you're selling something, at the end of the day, this impeachment has to be sold to the American voting republic. It's very simple. You tell a simple story that has relevance to the end user. The end user is the voter. We've heard a lot about Ukraine. We've heard about, national aid, aid to Ukraine. We've heard about, the Bidens. And the challenge is, well, how does that come back to the kitchen table? Well, basically, Vindman set it up today when he said undermining national security. Because now I can turn to a voter. I'm going to take that even one step further and say the president, his primal job is to protect us. Messed with your national security. Forget our national security. He made you and your family less safe. The most holy, sacred thing he can do, and he did it for his own behalf. That's a kitchen table issue. So it's not about the Ukraine. It's not about military aid. It's not about the Bidens and any kind of scandal. It's about he, to you, the voter, made you and your family less safe. That's something that stays on the kitchen table.
Let me ask you about what Annie reported, that all of the people that would normally have the line responsibility for smearing the Mueller probe when that was the investigation hanging over this White House. One is in Riyadh, which is an irony we need another hour to delve into. The others are sort of under their desks in a duck and cover. Are you surprised?
Not at all. And, two things are happening. There's a duck and cover. I know in the next segment we're going to get into the smear campaign. You have people like John Thune and Liz Cheney. You're seeing a turn. You're seeing either silence for most of the Republicans, or the Republicans, obviously Mitt Romney is at the front of it. I don't think it's beyond comprehension, as David said. And once again, we're early into this, but the Democrats have got to keep it tight. It is not beyond comprehension that they can't get 20 senators. We all know that in a private ballot, the Republicans don't want him there. Nobody wants him there anymore. He's really not good for anybody. You and I both know, everybody at this table knows, that they could take a secret ballot. I guarantee you there would be about a 98-2 vote because the Republicans don't want him there. They just need air cover. And as each day goes on, they get a little bit more air cover. And if they can keep the story as simple as I made it, the president sold out your safety. That's a compelling story.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.